Thumbs up, so now it'll... Everyone, I think we're about ready to get started. If you'll please take your seats. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Carter Sneed. I'm the director of the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. The center, as many of you know, is committed to sharing the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition through teaching and research and service and public engagement, both here at Notre Dame as well as in the broader public square. And one of the ways that we do that is through our book series at the University of Notre Dame Press with our wonderful colleague Steve Rinn, the director of that press, who's an amazing guy. Since 2016, our series entitled Catholic Ideas for a Secular World has featured works that engage the enduring themes of human dignity and flourishing, the common good, truth, beauty, justice, and freedom in a way that reflects and deepens principles affirmed by the Catholic Church for millennia, although not all of our authors are Catholic. I'm, again, very grateful to Steve Rinn for his extraordinary partnership in this way. We've been able to publish a great array of vital and thought-provoking authors, including Remy Bragg, Gil Meilander, Jean Bethke Elshtain, Pierre Manat, David Schindler Jr., Erika Bacchiacchi, and others. Today, we're delighted to celebrate the release of the 13th volume in our series, in that particular series, entitled The Collapse of Freedom of Expression, Reconstructing the Ancient Roots of Modern Liberty by our dear friend, Father Jordi Pujol. He was a visiting fellow of the De Nicola Center from 2016 to 2017, during which time he worked on this manuscript, and it's our great pleasure to bring him back to Notre Dame to discuss its themes with us today. I'm also grateful for our panelists and friends, Paolo Carozza, Rick Garnett, my colleagues in the law school. Unfortunately, our colleague Diane Desierto was to join today's panel, but unfortunately has been delayed in New York by her work at the United Nations, though she was kind enough to send along her reflections, which we'll share with you all today as well. So I'm going to very briefly introduce our speakers so we can conserve as much time as possible for discussion, and then invite Father Jordi to offer a brief précis of the book, at which point we'll move on to the panelists' comments and Father Jordi's response before opening it up to conversation and questions. So, first of all, to my right, my wonderful colleague Paolo Carozza, professor of law and concurrent professor of political science at Notre Dame, and until very recently, the director of the Kellogg Institute. My colleague Rick Garnett, the Paul J. Scherl Fort Howard Corporation professor of law at the Notre Dame Law School, as well, also a concurrent professor of political science, and he is the founding director of Notre Dame's Law School's program on church, state, and society. And with that, we will begin. Father Jordi.
Thank you very much. And before starting to talk about the book, allow me 2 minutes just to say thank you to the outstanding team of the Nicola Center. I mean, this research started almost 10 years ago in Rome and here. I mean, grew tremendously during my stay here at Notre Dame and being a fellow at the center. So this project grew through meaningful conversations with Paolo, with Rick, I mean, many outstanding scholars, and hosted by Carter and his tremendous and amazing crew. So conversations with Alsdair, Randy Kozel, Patrick Deneen, Sean Kelsey. The support of the center led my research also to be a visiting scholar at Columbia Journalism School, and afterwards at Harvard, and in these places also this work matured a bit more. So thank you for the support. I've been presenting this book in some places in East Coast, but for me, Notre Dame is the place to say thank you with capital letters. All books have editors behind that make them happen, and for this I'm grateful to Margaret Cabanis, Director of Research at the Center, obviously to Carter and Steve Rinn, and all the people at the press that have been accompanying this project. So thank you sincerely. So in this book, I'm going to be very brief, but I tackle the key aspects of the exercise of expression. Ultimately, is the question of tolerance of evil, of harmful speech, and the limits to speech. I examine the sustainability of the building of freedom of expression and what threatens its edifice, that are restrictions and compulsions, and how the different schools of thought have answered to this question of harmful speech. Liberals, communitarians, libertarians, critical race theory, feminists. The thesis of this book is that the liberal tradition of freedom of expression was built upon legal and moral foundations that were borrowed from an inherited tradition based on Christianity, Greek philosophy, and Roman law. All this has been taken for granted. Modernity disregarded these roots to build a new order that was needed, but that redefined many key concepts under this new paradigm, a new idea of man and freedom, also of law and justice, with its moral and legal positivism. The book opens with a first part with emblematic cases, followed by a part of diagnosis of what has gone wrong, and finally a proposal to rebuild this building of freedom of expression that is so key, it's so crucial for our democracy and live together. So I suggest for this rebuilding part to rebuild the notion of tolerance that needs to be also, the rebuilding of tolerance and harm as two key notions to face free speech in the modern world and precisely in this digital ecosystem. So I suggest strengthening the harm principle in conjunction with the rules of philosophy of language and bringing also theology in. So philosophy of language can be very helpful to distinguish satire from gratuitous insult because there are some discursive actions that are not expressions of ideas, but exaltations of insult, mockery. There are fraudulent uses of expression that violate the internal grammar that that expression has. And the wisdom of theology, studying human intentionality, is also very helpful to unmask these abuses, instrumentalizations of speech as refuge. Sometimes you hear opportunists saying, I didn't intend to offend, but in expressive acts, we cannot separate voluntary human action from its intent. We cannot separate the ends from the means, since they are united in the person. So free speech, again, is a crucial building for public life, for public conversation, for democracy, a particularly sensitive one, solid and fragile. So my point about this system of freedom of speech is that is built on an unstable balance of contrary forces that they are never fully solved. It can be instrumentalized, weaponized. The temptation to solve the problem is to regulate all behavior and to prevent all harm. As you know, the tradition in Europe is very different, with hate speech laws from here. Free speech is not an easy fix. Lives in this permanent unsteadiness. Tolerance of evil requires moral and legal deliberation. John Durham Peters talks about moral gymnastics. So it's about, we are not going to fix it only with laws. We need this moral growth that Solzhenitsyn was talking about in his speech at Harvard. So the point is that with this digital ecosystem, we need to do something. And I guess that we are going to be talking about this. And obviously, in an American context, if we talk about regulating, you get nervous. But come on, many things are happening, and we need to find an agreement that goes beyond probably national boundaries. I'm going to stop here, because if not, I'm going to be taking over the time. So I'm just, as a way to start, and then...
Thank you so much, Father Jordi. We're going to hear now my wonderful colleague, whom you mentioned, by the way, is the director of our research and publications. Nothing that we do in our publication series, really nothing we would do at all, would be possible without Margaret's extraordinary service. So it's a delight to have her on the stage in a speaking role, which is normally she's the straw that stirs the drink. But right now, Margaret's going to read Professor Desierto's intervention so we can have the benefit of her thought, even though she's not able to join us.
Thank you, Carter. Father Pujol's book provides a magisterial approach to what was previously a comprehensive conception of freedom of expression, considering the needs of faith-based or faith-related expression, as well as more secular conceptions of freedom of expression. The book examines this encompassing key norm and freedom within liberty and human society, eventually narrowed with the redefinition over time of three key concepts. One, the public space. Father Pujol does an authoritative examination of the role of the sacred and the secular in defining and redefining these spaces within American jurisprudence. Second, the purposes or values protected by freedom of expression. Father Pujol rightly shows how the corresponding faith-based and secular understandings of humanity also generated different values behind human dignity and what it means to be human. Third, the limitations or restrictions to freedom of expression and how the compartmentalization of the sacred and secular provides useful narratives to see the contrasts between First Amendment values in United States constitutionalism, which places few and rare limits on speech, for example, obscenity, performative threats amounting to illegal conduct, child pornography, fraud, fighting words, etc., and the more expansive approach of European jurisprudence outlawing hate speech as incitement. I am in general agreement with the first three parts of Father Pujol's book, and most especially his ideas on reconstructing the foundations of freedom of expression in Part 4, and revisiting how the harm principle operates in public and private speech. I focus my remarks on Father Pujol's view that, quote, although he is sympathetic with treating the harm caused by speech as an objective damage that requires justice, he does not think hate speech laws are the way to solve the problem. Father Pujol notes that hate speech laws are, and this is a quote, ineffective. They are also counterproductive, as they are easily utilized by lobbying groups, lobbies that have had great success in achieving notoriety and in the social promotion of their interests. Seeing the great number of people making a living out of lobbying, he sympathizes with Madison's fear of faction regarding the common good of society. Pujol goes on to say, pluralism of ideologies requires some civic virtues, respect, dialogue, toleration, and a common horizon of coexistence that faction does not allow by its own design, which is canceling, calling for no debate, or publicly shaming rival worldviews, end quote. My minor differences with Father Pujol on this point about hate speech are conditioned by my experiences of doing international law and international human rights law work. Father Pujol's idea of a public space, one that fully permits sacred and secular, is an ideal one, which may well be achievable within one jurisdiction. However, this ideal public space is not so readily available in the international system, where there is no equality of voice, equality of access to that public space of global decision-making, and certainly no equality between, among, and within the states that largely drive this decision-making in the international system and persist in denying non-states the functional equality of voice, action, and critique at the United Nations and elsewhere. Hate speech laws emerge not just from the historical experiences of racial hatred in the Holocaust or with mass genocides in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, but also because the very same foundational treaty obligations to prevent harm through, quote, any and all appropriate means that states assumed in international law also provide legal justification for crafting hate speech laws to apply within the territorial jurisdictions of these states. And she refers to the Charter of the United Nations, the duties of states to respect the rights to self-determination and non-discrimination, as well as specific provisions of the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and many others. Were it not for the work, indeed, of active lobbying by international, regional, and national human rights organizations and civil society mobilization at the United Nations, harm prevention against incitement and hate speech would have been left to the auspices of individual states, not all of whom have the same domestic or constitutional commitments to rule of law, equally accessible public spaces and courts, and speech-based remedies, for example, counter-speech or more speech, against the normalization of rampant expressions of racial hatred, hatred against women, hatred against refugees and immigrants, hatred against the poor, and hatred against any vulnerable group who constitutes the other and is often blamed for social ills experienced by the majority. I agree with Father Pujol that Madison's conceptualization of a faction could ultimately be dangerous to achieving the common good of society. But short of hate speech laws and many other preventive measures, including education and historical texts, jurisprudence and reparations, especially on memory and memorialization of mass atrocities and severe discrimination, Father Pujol's text is silent on what the alternative is. I agree that the process of lobbying is imperfect, no more so than at the United Nations, where only those with dominant ideologies from Human Rights Watch, Human Rights First, Amnesty International, and others get the best access to UN special procedures and report writing. But would I necessarily shut that door of lobbying in an already lopsided, imperfect, and unequal international system where 72% of humanity's population, according to the 2023 Varieties of Democracy World Report, is now living under autocratic rule? Freedom of expression is indeed all the more important in these times, but in my view, so is the safeguard against the deepening equivalence autocrats place between pretextual using freedom of expression as a legal justification to permit the widening disinformatia of the marketplace of ideas by seeding speech that is nothing more than hatred against races, women, minorities, refugees, the poor, and the most vulnerable. In these times, more than anything else, I would be careful about drawing the line on hate speech and risk having to judicially challenge its misuse by others, than to let incitement, discriminatory language, and hate speech run free online and offline, especially when none of us can realistically invoke a right to be forgotten or the right to have such speech be forgotten. I agree with Father Pujol that we need better free speech based on a common understanding of human good, but that is the project of actually realizing the human right to education, as worded in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Short of full realization of that right, international experience has taught me that hate speech doesn't necessarily provoke counterspeech as an easy remedy. Rather, hate speech teaches the most vulnerable to silence themselves and seek to become invisible out of the very fear that their race, sex, appearance, belief system, or status in life provokes the hatred of a dominant majority. My thanks to Father Pujol for the wonderful opportunity to read his opus, and I very much wish I could be there in person to deliver these comments at the De Nicola Center. I'm still here at work at the United Nations headquarters today, seeking to build the cooperation that Father Pujol also seeks.
Thank you, Margaret, for Professor Desierto's remarks. Next, we will hear from Paolo Carozza.
Thank you. Is this on?
I think so.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to have you back, Father Jordi. Thank you. And to see the fruits of the many conversations that we had while you were here on campus. It's a gift for all of us to hear from them. There are only a few minutes, so I can only say so much, in particular about the many contributions that this book makes in diagnosing the problems of free speech. In the first part of the book, as Father Jordi pointed out, he takes up these case studies. One of the things that the book does so interestingly is trace the common roots of very disparate problems in the area of free speech. In other words, to see what are the ways in which these highly different manifestations of the problem that we're facing in the collapse of freedom of expression have certain common roots and pathologies, and in particular that those roots are so present in the erosion and reduction of the classical and religious and specifically Christian foundations for freedom of expression historically. So to ask the questions again of the why, the what for of freedom of expression, how that relates to both the sacred and the secular, and the virtues of self-restraint, and above all, how it relates to a classical and Christian understanding of the common good, I think are exceptionally important contributions to the discussion. The other one, sort of the common root in particular that I would highlight beyond all of those is the problem of relativism and the collapse of the very notion of truth. For so long, we've heard, the teachings of the church provide a clear clarion warning against the implications of relativism, and for too long, even for those of us sympathetic, perhaps it was easy to say, oh yeah, that's just an abstract problem, right? That's a theoretical problem or something. And now you see very much what the very tangible, concrete consequences of that are. He addresses these things then bringing to bear a variety of different disciplinary perspectives. And so methodologically, too, it is quite an admirably Catholic book in addressing reality and the totality of the way of looking at it in an integrated way. And finally, he is looking for and proposing ways out of this tangled web in which we find ourselves now. in ways that take the values of freedom of expression seriously while not dismissing the problems themselves and the new things that are arising in the world in this area. So it's not a reactionary book in the tiniest bit, and that's important, I think. So in fact, for the rest of the few minutes that I have, I wanted to focus exactly on one of these new things in the area of freedom of expression that is so challenging, one that I am spending a lot of my time and energy on lately, and sort of to tease out how some of the, or at least to pose some questions about how the ideas in this book might help us in that area. And specifically what I'm talking about is the challenges that are posed by online exercises of freedom of expression through social media platforms. Father Jordi, some of your diagnosis and prescriptions in this area, that I've drawn from a variety of different portions of the book. You take it on throughout the book, in some senses, in recurrent ways. You refer to how both law and jurisprudence are necessary, and in using those words, just to be clear for everybody in the audience, to express both the need for regulation, for legislation about it, but also for the case-by-case adjudication with sensitivity to the realities of things like the intention of the speaker and those things that have a granular kind of a judgment required. You emphasize the need for public responsibility, and so to look at something like content moderation as an exercise in public interest and not simply in the economic interests of Facebook to be able to preserve its advertising base. An emphasis on the common good in all of this, which is challenging when what we're talking about is a global phenomenon, right? You yourself acknowledge we're talking about 3 billion users, right? More than the entire population of China or India. And most centrally, the book tries to address some of these new things by taking on and reframing the harm principle. This is within the areas that I think is most provocative and raises a lot of interesting questions. Adding a notion of an offense principle to the idea of harm. Understanding in a broader way the dignitarian concerns that are present when harmful speech is deployed, right? Focusing more intently on the intention behind speech helps us to gauge that harm, as well as you even mentioned in your opening remarks. And one thing that I, the jurist in me loves most in it is the resurrection of an appeal to the abuse of right principle, one that has a venerable pedigree in legal history and jurisprudence, even codified in international human rights treaties, but has largely fallen into desuetude across the juridical space. Right? And then, one last thing is your appeal to sort of seeing the platforms on which these kinds of expression are taking place as information fiduciary, is a concept borrowed from Jack Balkin. And so for all these reasons, you yourself, just to quote your own words, Father Jordi, sort of concludes saying it's urgent to have a public conversation about moderation policies as a matter of public interest, right? And this is not possible if said companies are not fully transparent, which is a separate point, and if we do not have a global legal paradigm. Okay. So here's the questions that this begins to provoke for me. I mean, in my work in this area now, the things that are sort of overwhelmingly evident and impossibly intractable. One is scale. Scale and speed of what this is happening. We're talking about, billions of pieces of information a day, hundreds of millions of decisions being made a day on what should go up or what should come down. There's no way to do that without substantial uses of automation, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so forth. Okay. Secondly, the problem of anonymity. I mean, even to the extent that platforms sort of try to enforce authenticity of identity, you don't really know that. And even if you know a name, you don't know the people. It's anonymous in the sense that the expression is being directed out into a void, and it's not an actual exchange of communicative acts between real people. And more generally, I guess I would say that there is, that's a part of a larger abstraction from context, from community, from human relationships that these forms of expression have. And for all those reasons, it makes it extremely difficult to take something like intention into account. It makes it extremely difficult even to take the common good into account, because it's the common good refers to a community. So what is the community to which we're referring to that has a common good here, right? It makes it very difficult because we're talking about the intersection of public and private space. And you've tried to address this, but more specifically, how does public interest relate to business interest? What is the public interest in the diverse intersection of 3 billion people in the global space? And finally, more specifically, with regard to your framing of harm, the bewildering differences of context and meaning and language in this makes me wonder how exactly does a reframing of the harm principle actually cash out and help us here, right? We have to be aware on the one hand of things that you mentioned, like the digital context in which an expression is taking place, right? Trolling, flooding, campaigns of harassment rather than one simple verbal gesture. But also, we know full well the potential scale of the harms in the restriction of speeches as well, right? Not only in these certain expressions, but the unprecedented capacities that these platforms have to augment certain kind of speech or to suppress certain kinds of speech, to determine what has priority and what influences public life in ways that go beyond the crude word censorship, right? The deployment of a greater attention to dignity is close to my heart in these areas, even while I'm concerned about the slipperiness of the concept, right? And so how it might play out. Or, a word that is so often also, a counterweight to expression in this area, safety, right? How problematically that word is subject to so many different kind of nuances, again, in a context where we don't have a unified sort of community. So finally, a few questions for you on the basis of all of this. How do these principles and guidelines, in fact, cash out to address these problems? And even more specifically, how might they cash out as law? There's some times in which the narrative of the text seems to acknowledge in a very explicit way the limitations of law here and the need to go beyond law. But I'd love to hear more about that, right? Where is the limit of the legal here? And then as a subset of that, where is the limit or the relationship between self-regulation, right? Several times you say, well, it's clear in this area that self-regulation is not enough. Okay. I'm directly involved in one of the efforts at self-regulation. I'll be the first to concede it's not enough. But what's the next step then? If it's not enough, then what exactly is the relationship or the proper role of private ordering, which has been so important to the actual conduct of expression in our communities, and the public regulation, the regulation in the public sphere? And finally, I would ask just sort of a more broad question that, given this audience, given the fantastic work that the De Nicola Center does and what brings us together here more than anything else, how do these problems, actually relate to what it means to be a Christian witness of truth in the modern world? What does it mean to bring a Catholic perspective, not just to the ideas, but to the substantive work that we're called to do in the world in order to, reconstruct, as you put it, the authenticity of what freedom of expression is for in the context of human flourishing?
Thank you. Thank you, Paolo. Before we move on to our final panelist, I'd like, just for the audience's sake, we gave such truncated introductions, if Paolo could share with you all what he was alluding to in terms of his concerns about content moderation policies are not academic. Paolo is involved in a very important enterprise. Why don't you tell the audience what it is that your affiliation and what you do?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, it's just that for the last 9 months or so, I was appointed to a body called the Oversight Board, which is created by the company Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram. And the Oversight Board's mandate is to make binding decisions on appeals to it regarding content moderation disputes on those platforms, and to make policy recommendations to Meta regarding how it should change and reform its policies and enforcement of those content moderation policies.
Thank you. Our final panelist, Professor Rick Garnett.
Thanks, Carter, and thanks to all of you for being here. It strikes me that a conversation about the freedom of expression has at least 3 dimensions, and I think that Father Jordi's book operates nicely in all 3 of these dimensions. So the first, there's the dimension where we're discussing the moral and the theoretical and the philosophical questions about the foundations for the freedom of expression and the ends or the purposes or the telos of that freedom. In this dimension, we might ask, what makes it true, if it is true, that human persons in fact enjoy a right to freedom of expression? What does it mean to say that? A squirrel doesn't enjoy the freedom of expression, but we do. Why is that the case? What is this freedom for? Is it for anything, or is it a freedom merely a license to kind of direct outward whatever the untethered id of the speaker happens to latch onto? And Father Jordi has a lot to say about these big picture first dimension questions in this book. This is the area where he's calling us to look beyond and to question some of the kind of reductionist and maybe hyper individualistic autonomy-oriented assumptions that a lot of our law and doctrine is based on, and he's calling our attention to maybe some older ways of thinking about what the freedom of speech is for, a richer way of thinking about what the human person is, thinking about what the implications are of the fact that we have human dignity and so on. Big questions, great stuff. The second dimension where this freedom of expression conversation happens is with respect to the policies and practices that we as a community might adopt within the realm of the constitutionally permissible that would make the freedom of expression work better. What are the things that we can do? What are the concrete policies we can put in place that will make it possible for free speech to work better, to achieve its ends, right? To happen smoothly with due regard to all competing interests. And at this level, you might talk about a wide variety of things, right? You might talk about education funding and school curricula. You might talk about the higher education space or public funding for the arts. You might talk about things like the design and construction of public spaces where expression happens. You know, those spaces can be more or less conducive to human flourishing generally, but also perhaps to human expression well exercised. Another policy you might think about is, or a set of policies rather, are those policies that go to the health and vitality of civil society organizations. I think one of the things we've learned is that the freedom of expression works better, and indeed democracy works better, when you have a thick and rich civil society where civil society is not hollowed out, where there is that space between the state and the individual. What kind of policies can we enact to help make that space rich? Things like tax exemptions for churches, perhaps, or for universities. In any event, this is all at this second dimension. It's where we're talking about what I and others have called the infrastructure of the freedom of expression. What does the freedom of expression need in its kind of bones and guts to work? Again, Father Jordi's book is very helpful at this level too. But a third dimension, and it's, if I have any expertise to offer, it might be here. The third dimension has to do with the constitutional and legal rules relating to expression, its facilitation, its regulation, and perhaps even its suppression. Now, these rules vary from place to place. As you've heard several times, the rules that are in place, the positive law of free speech, they're different in the United States than they are elsewhere. And this difference actually goes pretty deep in American law and culture. It's not one that I think is going to dissolve simply by through the invocation of global law, but we can talk about that later. So for me, the key thing to latch onto at this third dimension are, I should say, the requirements and demands of the First and 14th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States. Right? For me, that's the relevant law. Other jurisdictions have other laws. There might well be treaty obligations, and again, Father Jordi has alluded to global law, but for practical purposes at this moment, I want to just identify a few features of the American law of free expression. And then as I go through these, you might ask yourself, which of these features of America's free speech regime makes sense to you? If Father Jordi's arguments and proposals are taken seriously, are there aspects of the American regime that would need to change? Does anyone think that the American free speech regime should be somehow trumped or displaced by rules that other jurisdictions might prefer? So here's just a few of those key features, and those of you who are law students will cringe at how superficial I'm going to be. Or maybe not, maybe you'll be relieved. The first thing is that American free speech law has incorporated a very broad definition of what counts as expression. Right? It is not just talking about stuff. It is not just talking about politics. I'm one of those who thinks that the definition of expression in American law is way broader than it was intended by the generation that adopted our Constitution. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. I just report it as data. But the first thing to appreciate is that American free speech law treats as speech a lot of stuff. And one thing you want to appreciate about that is that the more that a legal regime tries to protect, the less strong are going to be the protections that it's able to afford to provide to that stuff. This is just kind of like an iron law, more is less. Right? You can't provide absolute protection to speech if speech includes everything. That's one of the wrinkles, one of the challenges of American free speech law. Second feature of our law is that there are very few categories of unprotected speech. One implication of this is that hate speech is not a thing in American law. It is not the case that there exists some identifiable body of expression called hate speech that is not protected. It is protected to say hateful, insulting, intentionally hateful and insulting and offensive things. This is a point that I find, at least when I'm teaching law students coming out of American universities today, that they're somehow surprised to learn, right? Because they've been instructed often that there is no right to engage in hate speech. Well, for better or worse, in American law, there is. There is no unprotected category called hate speech. Related to this, going to the harm principle that Father Jordi mentioned, is that the fact that speech is harmful does not make it unprotected. It might be a reason on balance to permit some regulation of it, but generally speaking, harmful speech can be protected. Speech does cause harm, and notwithstanding that fact, in America anyway, it is often still protected. Here's a third feature. We distinguish in American law between speech regulations that are aiming at the content of the expression and speech regulations that are not. Right? So the government has much more leeway when it's enacting laws that take the form of, say, no yelling in the park after midnight. But if it takes the form of no talking about socialism after midnight, that's different. Right? Content-based regulations of speech are highly suspect in American law and require a very weighty justification. Again, one of the things this means is that it is not a justification for the regulation of speech to say, well, we really need to regulate this speech because it's offensive. That's not going to be a reason. It doesn't count. Here's another feature. The rules that govern speech regulation can vary depending on the context of the speech, where it's happening, and also depending on the capacity in which the government is acting. So think about this. Sometimes the government's regulating us. The First Amendment is very worried about the government when it's regulating us. But the government employs us, it sends us money, it runs prisons, it runs schools, it runs jails, right? In all of these contexts, the government's ability to regulate your speech can change. So when you want to learn about American free speech law, you have to distinguish between what the government can do to the guy working in the post office from what the government can do to the guy who's on the front line in a war, to what the government can do to a kid in school, and so on. Next, American free speech law draws a very sharp line between the public and the private. Right? The First Amendment has nothing to say about what Facebook does with respect to its content moderation. Walmart is allowed to censor as much as it wants. I'm allowed to tell my children to be quiet. Right? Notre Dame is allowed to make decisions about what speakers it will or will not invite to campus. None of these things have anything to do with the First Amendment. Now, this is controversial in some jurisdictions, right? And even today, there are those who say, no, we should import First Amendment requirement and norms into the business sphere, say, because corporations have a lot of power. But at least as a legal matter, we distinguish between public and private. And then finally, our freedom of expression in the United States is a negative right. It is not a positive right. This, again, distinguishes us from a lot of other jurisdictions. There really isn't any law in America that gives anybody a right to speak, a right to a platform, a right to access. So when you hear arguments that take the form of, well, we need to limit that person's speech because they're powerful and wealthy and handsome, so that this person who lacks those attributes gets more speech, our law doesn't really permit that. Right? We don't have a norm of silencing some to enhance the voices of others. You're not entitled to speech mechanisms as a constitutional matter. So those are just quickly some features of our American free speech law, and one of the things I'd love to hear from Father Jordi is, well, given all that he's written in this book, which of those features are commendable and to be retained, and which ones would he like to see changed or abandoned by appropriate procedures? And in particular, with respect to the so-called digital age that's in the title of this talk, are there any aspects of the digital that require revisiting of some of those features of American law? And with that, Father Jordi, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Father Jordi. We'll give you an opportunity to respond to our panelists, and then we'll open the floor for questions and discussion.
So I think that now you understand the composition of this table, that I think it couldn't be better, in the sense that Professor Desierto, an approach from United Nations, sympathetic to the European approach, that puts human dignity as the cornerstone of everything. So protecting values, as she has said, not only because of the experience of Nazi regime, and we are very, sensitive to see, we don't want, discrimination on any ground because of what we have experienced as a continent, in Europe. But it goes beyond, because it's present in many of the constitutions, and I think a paradigmatical one, the German one. I remember talking to Marianne Glendon about this and about my book a couple of years ago, and she suggested explore the idea of human identity in the German constitution, because so the European framework is very sensitive to harm and to the harm done in any basis and to all people. And then we have obviously the American tradition that Rick has explained very well, and things that are constitutive, so it's like are essential to the legal and I would say cultural tradition in this country. And then Paolo Carozza, that he's in the oversight board trying to face a problem of speech that is not bounded by the boundaries of a nation, but it has this global impact. So I think that it has come perfectly well, the dilemmas here that freedom of expression is posing today and now. So that's why in the book I spend a lot of time trying to make the diagnosis, a lot of time looking to where we come from, legally speaking, philosophically speaking. Theology also plays a role here. But then saying, hey, how could we, get out of here? What could be a solution? I'm not in the book, unfortunately, so I don't want to. I'm not offering, solutions for policy making. Okay, so in this sense, I'm creating more problems that I solve. Okay, but I think that sometimes we need that. To reflect on where we come from, to reflect from the problems, and to open up conversations that make us think outside the box. So I totally understand and sympathetic with Professor Desierto, and that's why, and this has caused me several problems because I engage and I work, a bit with Jeremy Waldron from NYU. He's super sympathetic to the harm done by speech and suffered by minorities. And I think that the legal tradition in free speech is a bit arrogant on this. So that harm is seen as something, very, cold. It looks at harm in a very, as taking offense privately. When I think that harm it can be objective, no? But obviously, we arrive to that objectivity not only through law. And that's why I bring in philosophy of language and I bring in theology. The suggestion, I think that this thinking outside the box, it can come, we're pushed to this because of the internet. We have private companies moderating public conversation. That's automatically like a red flag. Private companies moderating public conversation. That's why I think that the accountability of these platforms, they cannot say, my house, my rules, and this is how they are operating. So they put out this oversight board, I understand, because if not, the investment on them and, they can get in trouble. The only governments that are, holding them accountable is the European law with those huge fines. So Europe is fining strongly to these tech companies because they are obviously deciding heavily on speech. The system in America prevents that, precisely for what has been said by Professor Garnett. So and I agree with all three. My claim of exploring the possibility of a global legal framework, I think it's like a bit poetic in the sense that, but it has some grounds on reality. Okay, I rely there on Professor Domingo. He's at Emory, and he's suggesting this paradigm of global law that is inspired in these inherited legal traditions from Roman jus gentium, medieval jus commune, and elements of international law forged in the Enlightenment. Obviously, Paolo has said, high speed and far-reaching are the characteristic of speech online. That's why. That requires ex-ante solutions. So here, jurisprudence will not solve the problem online because there's no time. You need to fix the thing because it's so. And it's. I don't know if you have seen the consequences of deep fakes. No, I had to advise a seminarian in Rome from India. In Facebook was put out there a video. It was a deep fake. Normally they take clips that are offensive in the sense that they were pornographic, and they put he was a seminarian. Think about it. A 2-minute video of this seminarian engaging in that stuff produced by someone and put out in Facebook and going viral. Obviously, there's the takedown, rule that Facebook has 48 hours, between 48 and 72. So I helped him with that. Obviously, the consequences of this are, there's people committing suicide after one of these things happening because it ruins your reputation. So something must be done. And I don't know, in this case, we were talking to one of the rectors of the seminary. can a guy that has suffered this can become a priest? I mean, I can tell you they need to go to therapy, of course, because it's huge, the damage done. So many things that are happening digitally require ex-ante solutions. What do we do? Because we come from very different legal traditions. And as Professor Desierto has said, I mean, more speech and counter speech doesn't happen. Many times when we have these victims of this, they are just silent and they're, suffering, no? So, because harm is real. So, what this global legal paradigm suggests is that perhaps countries could sign a treaty, giving up a bit is, this, in this sphere of the digital ecosystem. So to give up a bit the power that, you have the power on your borders, right? So we should explore some of these ways as in an international setting, but finding some principles that bring the best of the European tradition, that bring the best of the American tradition, to make this synthesis precisely for this world. The distinction between private and public doesn't exist anymore. Professor Garnett has mentioned it. I mean, the separation between private and public that the law contemplates in the US and in many other countries, sorry, does not work for the digital ecosystem. Private and public, I mean, what's private and what's public when your cell phones are in your living room, no? So the distinction that inside my house is private sphere and so forth. So this global law is neither a total system nor a complete new legal system. It's more a system of systems. So it's combining international law but surpassing it by the very reality of globalization. It's like an ordo orbis. So I think it's more like putting the person at the center. That's what I like from that. So it's like an international society of nations. So it's not, the center is more the person and not just state sovereignty. I know this causes a lot of problems and a lot of debate. But I think already starting to talk about that is to start to talk about finding solutions. To answer also to Professor Carozza, I think that the solution here is hybrid, no? So it's a mixture of, we need here moral growth. We're not going to fix this only with global law, so we are not looking for a system. We need moral growth. But we need also self-regulation from these platforms, of course. But we know that they're going to self-regulate following their economic interests. So we cannot be naive. These guys are making a lot of money. I mean, again, private companies regulating public life, public debate, public, So that's why, yeah, I buy that self-regulation, because so the wisdom of not finding or not looking for a perfect system of systems, a perfect new legal system, but moral growth, self-regulation, and the states coming together. Of course, I don't know, Professor Desierto is not here to ask her, but the reputation of these international, institutions is not very high, no? I mean, so that's also something that is not helping, the lack of leadership on this, no? So, but again, I think that, and finally, to ask a very specific question, to answer a very specific question from Professor Desierto, what's the alternative to lobbying? I don't know, with this, I'm absolutely with Madison. I mean, those that govern are not angels. So But faction, it's only thinking in the interest of the own faction. A mere clash of factions, it does not guarantee automatically a pluralistic society. So we need to build some common ground, some common good that everyone is contributing, because if not, we will have every single faction looking only for its own interest. And this is my sense of what is happening in Europe. So all agendas are fighting, to get their message and their interests, across. But they don't work for the common project of humanity, So that's why with this I'm more sympathetic. I think that there's no perfection and I see good in both legal traditions. So in a very idealistic way, I see that perhaps we could find, a synthesis that I call this global liberal perspective that could bring the best of all these traditions. So this will be my answer, but I don't know if someone else wants to.
Can I say one quick
Yeah,
thing
please.
to
Yeah,
clarify, with respect to the public-private? So just to be clear, obviously, Father Jordi's correct that the public-private distinction in the sense of a sharp line between what happens in your house and what happens outside has broken down quite a bit. Right? That's not the distinction I'm talking about. The distinction I'm invoking and that American law relies on very heavily, and that's very important to political freedom in my view, is the distinction between state actors and non-state actors. We need to remember that it's essential to maintain that distinction precisely because non-state actors, like, say, the Roman Catholic Church or the University of Notre Dame, they have the right to engage in message-shaping, let's put it in quotes, censorship, that would be illegal for the government to do, right? So just to be clear for those, non-lawyer types, whatever, everybody knows that we're not completely private because our phones are in our house, but it nonetheless remains a feature of American law, and one that I think that we should value between state actors and non-state actors and the restrictions and protections that apply to the two.
A few quick observations on Father Jordi's remarks. So to some extent, some of these changes are already happening, right? Even in the short time since you drafted this, there have been dramatic changes because the environment is changing so fast. The Oversight Board was barely established. You referred to it here. It hadn't done any work. Now it's been around for 2.5 years and has been doing some pretty substantial work, and explicitly contradicts the idea that Meta is saying, my house, my rules. It has turned over its rules to an independent entity that is adjudicating those rules on the basis fundamentally of international human rights law. So that's a pretty dramatic change. Similarly, with the regulatory context, if the one thing that most strikes me about the regulatory context today, today as opposed to just even like a few months ago, is that the EU is not the only player anymore. Right? Brazil, India, Japan, a lot of countries are regulating, and they're regulating in different ways. And so it's very hard right now in the current environment for anybody to make sense of what regulations apply, even in fact, let alone normatively which regulations should apply or how they should be coordinated with one another, right? And then the last thing, is sort of reflection on these comments, especially on the exchange between Rick and Father Jordi, is this. It strikes me as, perhaps not as a formal legal matter, but in my view, certainly as a cultural matter, right? I'm a Tocquevillian in this. That the First Amendment premises were grounded on and successful because of certain cultural realities. And in particular, the kind of civic virtue and self-restraint that is generated by an essentially religious culture, right? So the collapse of the sacred, affects that, maybe not in ways that are yet affecting our formal law, and maybe they shouldn't affect our formal law, but something's got to fill that space. Either a recovery of the generative sources of civic virtue and self-restraint, or that vacuum is going to be filled by law. Yep. And the latter worries me, but the first one I don't know how to do that.
Great. Thank you all for such rich comments. We have about 15 minutes for conversation. If you all could identify yourself and then ask your question or make your comment, but please keep it brief so that we can have as much intervention as possible. We'd like to start with a student. If there's a student who would like to jump up, and there we go. Tell us your name and who you are.
Pardon me. My name is Isaac Kimmel. I'm a doctoral candidate in the sociology department. I've been a Soren Fellow for 4 years. So Professor Carozza, I think, just said that he didn't know how to do this, but I'm curious about the potential role of inter non-state actor accountability in promoting free speech and combating hate speech and disinformation, right? So what provoked my line of thinking on this is I read a really compelling book from about 5 years ago from some fellows at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Democracy at Harvard, in which they argue, among other things, that one of the central causes of the disinformation and polarization that are afflicting the U.S. public sphere right now is a fracturing of our media, right? And so historically, our major news outlets have held each other accountable by fact-checking each other and like upholding each other's credibility by citing each other, but they're also trying to scoop each other, and there's like a respectful competition. But since about the 90s, there's been this wide and increasing gap between right-wing media outlets and then the center and left that makes the right much more susceptible to disinformation and agenda setting by the fringe because it's not being fact-checked anymore. So, historic news outlets might share an ideology, but at least they're holding each other factually accountable. And then something else that I was thinking about was Twitter's Birdwatch initiative, which I think Elon Musk has rebranded Community Notes, where users can rate respected users, and I'm not sure what the criterion is for that, can rate each other's tweets as being factual or not, hate speech or not. And as I understand it, that was pretty successful in an experimental context, at least. So first, and I think, Professor Garnett, you may have been getting at this when you alluded to civil sphere actors, but I'm curious for you to develop on that. But first, is there a way the government can encourage non-state actors to evaluate each other, basically, on factual or moral grounds? And second, could the state intervene in civic discussions, not just by promoting or suppressing speech, but by presenting an official account?
So, just two really quick things, and obviously my colleagues can weigh in. First, with all due respect, I don't think your historical claim is true. It was actually a very small little window in American history where media outlets held themselves to some kind of stated norm of objectivity and holding each other accountable. And for most of our history, the media was the wild, wild west, and all newspapers were partisan, and it was kind of a wild, crazy mess. So that's not to endorse it normatively, but I think we need to kind of embrace the fact that it was the halcyon days of the objective accountability fact-checking media was actually a pretty small window, which might tell us something about how plausible it is to recreate that. Second thing, with just to say with respect to governments and official accounts. So the government is allowed to say what it wants under our law, subject only to the Establishment Clause. You can't endorse a religion. But other than that, the government's allowed to have its official account. During the Cold War, we had the Voice for Democracy, and the government didn't feel the need to say, and now for the voice of the dictatorship of the proletariat. They felt like they could take sides. So the government is allowed to take sides, but I'm one of those who tends to be worried about official government accounts of many things. Again, it's entirely appropriate for the political authority that speaks for our political community to, endorse democracy and not totalitarianism or what have you. That's appropriate. But when you start wandering too far away from the national consensus and giving official accounts on disputed matters, I don't like it when the governor of a particular state lights up a building to celebrate a particular political decision or to regret another one about which people disagree. So I'd be nervous about that, to be honest. But third, your civil society point, obviously civil society organizations can and should hold each other accountable, and they have the right to do it as strictly as they want to, it seems to me.
Father Jordi, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing that you mentioned just en passant, but I think it's interesting. The notion of truth online is a consensual notion of truth, that we must be aware that that's not only dangerous, but that's not true. I mean, reality is not something that we negotiate. Reality is very stubborn. So this negotiated notion of truth, because the consumers are flagging what's credible and what's not. So that engagement, we sell it under the name of engagement, no? These platforms. And that leads to a negotiated notion of truth. I said, sorry. Truth is linked to reality, what things are. And that's why we're getting into big trouble, because we are building this bubble of a notion of truth that is consensual, but that's, in many cases, it leads us very far away from reality. And that produces, that's damaging, no? Our social fabric dramatically.
More questions? Yes. Tell us your name.
I wanted to defend the students' point a little bit, so we can push back on Rick a little bit. You mentioned the mid-90s as being this period where it seemed to fall apart. That was, 96 was the Telecommunications Act, which deregulated the whole telecom industry. It made it possible for anyone to get in, but also for large groups to conglomerate media. So, in theory, before that, you could have independent media outlets with lots of different voices. But now with Comcast, Facebook, whatever, you get this conglomeration of not just media companies, but ideologies into these large, kind of intractable sorts of positions. So I'm wondering, and I haven't read the book yet, but I'm just curious about the economics of this as it relates to the legal, right? So if you have this deregulation, you have this power that's consolidated among just a few groups who can then control narratives or control censorship. I find it very interesting, by the way, that we're now seeing lots of book banning happening in schools again, almost because there's a feeling of, this digital thing is so overwhelming that perhaps we can go back to the print age and sort of ban or censor books again. Maybe that's how we push back against this, because as Paolo pointed out, the speed and scale is just so tremendous. So I guess from an economic perspective, I don't know if you covered this, but what role does that play in sort of the control and censorship of speech? Because it is a political economy happening here. So I'm just wondering if that's addressed in the book or how you would.
I mean, I can say a tiny bit about it, but not very much. But just to point out that, I think it's you take something like Meta. Obviously, they're interested in making money. I mean, they're not there to control speech. They're not there to influence politics. That's not what they're trying to do. I mean, there may be some individuals within it who love the fact that they're in a position where, the way that they prioritize what gets into your news feed might influence. But as a company, they're there to make money, right? And so what are they trying to do? They know that their money is coming from people who post pictures of puppies and babies, right? And not from the people who are interested in using it for politics. And so that's what they're oriented toward. They're trying to preserve the environment that gives them the basis that that allows them to then sell data to advertisers for the families that they're doing. And so there's certainly an economics in behind the concentration of control, but it is not in most cases. I don't think it's not directly related to an intention or an aim to control public life in this way. And I think that makes it extremely difficult to get a handle on what's going, because it operates through these much more indirect and means that are hard to identify, and precisely by being hard to identify because they're not being intentional, they're correspondingly hard to control.
Brett, I mean, maybe we just disagree on this. I would distinguish between consolidation and objectivity. Those are two separate questions, it seems to me. You're certainly right that 96 brought about some big changes in telecom regulation. But I don't think, at least I wouldn't characterize that change as being a move from kind of neutrality, objectivity, and accountability to something else. It was the case before 96, the case before the internet, before cable television, that, you know, 3 networks and a few anchors on those networks, and then the editors of a few large newspapers had way more control over the American public debate than Meta does today. So, and of course, before 96, you know, you didn't have all these other outlets. You know, first it was, I guess, websites, and then blogs, and then Twitter, and Substack, and everything. So, whether on balance there's been more centralization of control over public discourse or less, is not clear to me. It's not clear to me that we have a greater concentration of control today than we did in the Walter Cronkite days.
But isn't it interesting that in 96, the internet's also coming online, so at the very moment when that regulation was helpful to preserve independent voices, it was tossed out. I think that's, I mean, respect to disagree, but like, I think that's like the crucial point, is the confluence of legal and technological at that moment.
Sometimes it's always a benefit just to achieve disagreement.
Jordi.
I think it was very interesting what happened in this country some months ago, that disturbingly for the Europeans, they appeared that initiative from this administration, the administration that now is running this country, on this sort of ministry of truth. So for me it was, I mean, this clarification that Rick has made is so crucial. Who is moderating, I mean, the private and the public actors. So it was, for us, it was super frightening. I mean, if the United States is putting out that, I mean, we're done. I mean, because if the public government is controlling in this way, no? Truth. So the regulation of news, it has been always this balance that we have. I think that culturally speaking, the different systems have tended to allow a lot of room to freedom, to allow a lot of room to falsehood, because to start regulating truth is to establish this Orwellian system, no? So that's why I think we are going to see initiatives from private institutions as the oversight board, and this shift that Paolo has rightly said. I mean, they sensed that criticism, and they brought in those independent, they keep their, you know, the quota of the different, you see the oversight board, and I think it's beautiful that Paolo is there, and other amazing people making their contribution.
We do love Paolo, and he's going to make a short comment. Go ahead, Paolo.
So I mean, this is a question, it's prompted by these 2 questions, but I want to direct it to Father Jordi. It strikes me that one of the things one of the underlying problems that these comments are pointing to, without having used the word, is not like the concentration of influence or not. It's the absence of authority. It's the collapse of authority. Right? We don't have authority anymore. I mean, nobody has authority. And so you don't know what to, I mean, so especially in a place where we're talking about Catholic ideas for the world, right? As Catholics in the Catholic tradition, we know that authority, properly understood, obviously not authoritarianism, but that authority is necessary to truth, and it's necessary to freedom. It's not antithetical to freedom. Yep. And here we don't have authority. So, but that's not a theme that you take up directly or explicitly in this book. So I'm wondering what you think of that. Where does the collapse of authority and the need for an authentic kind of authority fit into your arguments and your diagnosis?
So we are in the middle of a debate of clash of power. I think there's a confusion between authority and power. So, and again, these factions are seen as clashes of different powers. So trying to find power balances, no? That's where I see a dead end with the question of factions in place. So I see the need of a renewed leadership based on truth, because precisely authority is related to the exercise of truth. Authority is related to what things are, right? So, but this authority many times is also moral. So the renewal, and history tells us that the renewal of structures many times come from authoritative voices that are not normally occupying positions of power, but they are authoritative. So, but we need both. But yeah, this confusion between authority and power, and seeing authority as a service, and not also, I mean, not only seeing as a, no, I want to push that idea and that interest. No, so yeah, you are right.
Friends, we are at the end of our time together. I'd like to thank again Margaret Cabanis for her extraordinary support. I'd like to thank Brooke Tranton over there by the door. She also was instrumental and essential in putting this together. This is a great opportunity. I'm proud to be part of the University of Notre Dame and the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, where we can have thoughtful conversation and engagement in this way. Thank you all for coming, and there are, our friends at Notre Dame Press are selling copies of Professor Jordi Pujol's book, Father Jordi, and you should just buy as many of those as they have. It makes a lovely gift. Sparkling conversations are prompted by the reading of it, as we've seen today. So anyway, thank you all very much. Great to have you here, and come back soon to the De Nicola Center for more good conversations.